Hey, welcome back. Hope you're doing well. Coming to you from Vicksburg, Mississippi. We'll tell you a little bit about Vicksburg. Well, far back as anybody's been able to tell, this area was inhabited by some American Indians, or Native Americans, if you want to call them that, called the Natchez Indians. Well, they lived here for a long time and before anybody else came along. And I had said in one of my previous videos that a Frenchman named LaSalle came down the Mississippi River from the Great Lakes, and that's true. And they say that the that guy was Catholic, and the first Catholic religious ceremony or mass or whatever you want to call it was 1722 down around Natchez. Well, the French sent down some soldiers down the river, down the Mississippi River, and in order to try to claim and control land and also protect potential settlers and those that were already there, they set up a fort a little bit north of here called Fort St. Pierre. And it's in the place that today is called Redwood. It's a little community. Well, the French, they went on down the river and they they explored and occupied and took control of other places like Natchez and Vicksburg, and of course, a well-known example where the French were was New Orleans. But anyway, the French, they their interactions with American Indians were not always good, and with the Natchez, they set up fur trading and they had some commerce with them and some trading, and they got along okay, I guess, initially. But at a certain point, uh, down around Natchez, they had a really kind of a massacre. To be honest, they killed the Natchez Indians, killed a whole bunch of French folks, mostly men, and it was their custom and practice uh, that when something like that would go on, they would take the women and children as hostages or POWs, you might say, and they would incorporate them into their tribe, and they would kind of have a blended family, you might say. So they did that. Well, uh, the French didn't like that, as you might imagine, and they tried to put a stop to all that and put those Natchez Indians in check and correct that behavior. And the Natchez had a natural or a historical adversary called the Choctaw, which are much more well known. And the French allied themselves with the Choctaw, and they had a like a little war that went on, and the Choctaw prevailed and took control of a lot of areas until later when they had the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek and the Indian removals that took place in the 1830s and all. But anyway, back to the French. So the French were here that when they came down and set up Fort Saint Pierre, that was in 1719. And later on, we can get into this in another video, but later on there were some geopolitical events, and the Spanish were in charge. And the Spanish set up their own fort, and they called it Fort Nogales. And it's in the area today around Vicksburg, Mississippi, where it's referred to as Walnut Hills. And they had Fort Nogales there. Now, little side note, there is a house here in Vicksburg called McRaven. A lot of these big fancy houses back then, they'd give the house a name. Well, this house is called McRaven, and it's still here today. In fact, it's a museum, and they say a haunted museum. In fact, when they do TV shows and documentaries and all that about haunted houses and haunted places, McRaven is frequently in the top 3 in the entire United States. And part of that may be because of what I'm about to tell you. When the Spanish were in charge of this area and they were operating out of Fort Nogales, uh, there was a guy that lived in the first part of that house. That house was built in 3 sections and at 3 different times. And in the time when that guy lived there, uh, it was a 2-story, I don't know, like maybe 10 feet by 15-foot rectangle as far as the pad goes. And it was 2-story, and there was no stairs and no way to get up to the second story. Made out of brick. And the second story was not real high either. I guess if there was such a thing as a brick shack, that's kind of what this thing would be. Now, I'm drawing a blank what that guy's name was, but anyway, he was a bad guy. And the one of the main trading practices of this area back then was that if you had furs or tobacco or cotton or most anything that you wanted to sell, there's an ancient Indian road called the Natchez Trace. And today they call it the Natchez Trace Parkway. You could drive down it. It's paved now, but a long time ago it was a walking path, and then later it was a Indian road, and then later they used wagons on it, and now they have cars driving up and down it. Matter of fact, today I drove down a small section of it to get over here. But folks would travel down the Natchez Trace with their wares that they hoped or intended to sell, and they'd go over to places like Vicksburg or Natchez, or even they'd go further south down to New Orleans. All 3 of these places are on the Mississippi River, which is the 3rd largest river on earth. The Mississippi River. Well, they would travel down this road, and they'd go down there and sell their stuff. Or well, let me back. I told you wrong. They're going back up the other way. But it was a route of travel. Let me correct that. But they would come down the river and they would sell their stuff, and they'd come on flat bottom boats. And when they got to Vicksburg or Natchez or New Orleans, they would sell everything that they had to collect money. And during the Spanish time, the global currency or reserve currency that everybody wanted was called the Spanish milled dollar. And they had Spanish silver coins, and that was the if you needed money, that's what you wanted, was Spanish silver coins. It was guaranteed to be pure. Uh, well, this guy, when people would go down there and sell their stuff, they'd sell everything that they brought, including their flat bottom boat. They'd sell it for lumber. And then they'd use that money to buy horses and maybe a wagon. And they would come back up the trace like that with their money. Well, this guy I'm talking about living in McRaven, the bad guy, that was kind of his hideout, was that house. And he operated out of that house, robbing and killing. So when these folks were coming back up the trace and traveling up here, through here, after they sold their stuff, he'd find them and rob them and kill them and stuff like that. Well, when the Spanish heard of it, the Spanish uh, went and sought him out to find where he was living, and they found him, and they met up with him, and it ain't a treaty really, but they had kind of a meeting with him. And at this meeting, they asked him to stop robbing and killing in exchange for money. And they gave him, he agreed, and for a certain amount of gold and silver, he agreed that he'd stop robbing and killing. And then, not too long after they made that agreement, he went right back to robbing and killing. Well, this guy was really dangerous and crazy, you might say. And when he'd get back to his house, he was so paranoid that folks would try to get him that he had a rope ladder. And he'd get over to his house and he'd climb up that rope ladder to his bedroom. The kitchen was on the bottom floor. And he'd go to bed up there and pull that rope ladder up there with him where nobody could get him. Well, somehow or another, he met a woman, and I guess they fell in love or fate or whatever you want to call it. But they ended up being together, and I don't know that they got married or not. They may not have been, but she lived with him, and I guess fed him and took care of him while he was robbing and killing. And you might say, well, why would a woman be with a guy like that when apparently he was super crazy and dangerous? Well, I guess some folks like excitement, you know. But I would say that she was crazy herself, probably. And to prove my point, later, when he was asleep, she went in the bedroom and she cut him from ear to ear and killed him in that bed. And that bed where that happened is still in there, and you can go in there and see that. But anyway, that's when the Spanish were in charge, and they tried to make a deal with that guy, but it didn't work out. So back to Vicksburg. So due to the French protections and later the Spanish, people started moving here, and uh, Vicksburg is unlike other places. It was a frontier outpost, and it attracted settlers from all walks of life. And there were people here who came from Germany. There were Jewish people that came here, and they still have a presence today. And Vicksburg, to be such a small town, really, I mean, even today, the population's low. But to have such a low population, it's got a pretty cosmopolitan population. Because I don't know, they like I said, they got Germans and French, and of course descendants of the African American slaves, which they were African American, you know, and then of course I guess the regular white folks, but anyway, that went on for a while until 1825. 1825, they declared or decided or whatever you want to call it that this place would be a city. 1825. And it's called Vicksburg because it was named after a Methodist missionary named Vic. I think his first name was Newell Vic, I think. But he was a Methodist missionary, and they named the town after him. And he must have been of pretty good repute, otherwise that wouldn't have been justified. But they named it after him. Uh, so there it was, 1825, Vicksburg, Mississippi. And this was after Mississippi became a state, which Mississippi became a state in 1817. Prior to that, it was a territory. So obviously, this would have been when Louisiana was owned and controlled by the French until the Louisiana Purchase. And at different points in time, the central and southern part of Mississippi would have been controlled by the Spanish or the French when it was a territory, but it became a state in 1817. And they chopped it up into counties, and the counties have grown. I think now in the state of Mississippi, I think there's 82 counties. But Vicksburg is in Warren County, Mississippi, and Vicksburg is the county seat. That's the seat of the government of the county. Well, it's been a trading post all this time under all those different administrations and nationalities. And even today, the port of Vicksburg's got heavy river traffic, just like it did 200 years ago. Well, in 1858, so this is 3 years prior to the beginning of the Civil War, they built this place behind me, this courthouse, or they started on them. It took them 2 years to build it, 1858 to 1860. But they were building it, and talk started going on that maybe some of the states might secede, you know, and it was unknown what states those might be or where they might be until after a while it looked as though it was apparent that the majority or possibly all of the states that might secede would be in the geographical South. Well, the South as a whole, uh, they may tell you romantic ideas of the opulent South or sad tales of slavery conditions, but the population as a whole of the South, there was a lot of different perspectives on the idea of secession and also slavery. A lot of people, a lot of white people in the South, they wanted an abolition to slavery, and they thought that it was a bad practice and needed to be ended. And they had their own debates about how long it should take to do that or how to go about it. Uh, some people in the South, and particularly in Vicksburg and Natchez and New Orleans, they were not interested in secession. They were uh, they were making money from the way things were. Of course, by that time, the cotton boom had took taken off, and if you're making money and living large, you don't want anything to change. You want to keep on balling, right? So the people, by and large, in Vicksburg and Natchez didn't want to secede, and they voted against it and they spoke out against it. But obviously, the overarching move across the South was for secession. And ultimately, what they thought or said didn't matter a whole lot. So the South seceded. Now, uh, they tried different ways to cripple the South. The commanders of the South were the best ones that you could have had at the time, and their strategies and methods were better than their opponents, which were the North. Uh, and also another thing too, they'll tell you that they stopped all trade with cotton, and the South couldn't get commodities and all that. And I guess as a general statement, that kind of stuff is true. But what they won't tell you is the demand for cotton up north was still there, and people from the South were smuggling cotton to the North, and uh, gun makers and manufacturers that were up north smuggled products to the South during the war. They had to hide it, but that's what they did. But obviously, the much better equipped, although much much less prepared in terms of military prowess. The ones up north wanted to put an end to the war and stop this southern rebellion, or you know win, win really. And they tried different methods on land, and you can read all about the Civil War. But right here in Vicksburg, uh, topographically, Vicksburg is high on some bluffs overlooking the river. The other side of the river is flat. It's Louisiana. And Vicksburg set up some heavy guns on top of those hills and those bluffs. And they tried to come by water to take Vicksburg, but it didn't work. And those big heavy guns spoke on those hills, and they learned right quick that they weren't going to pass on water like that. So they were going to have to come up with something different. So they went. This was Grant, uh, who later became president. But he went further south down below Vicksburg and came across, and they came up on land and laid siege to the town. And they by water it was near impregnable, so they decided that they would block their supplies and try to starve them out. Well, it was a good strategy, and it prevailed in pretty short order because of the shelling that took place off the river and the siege itself. The inhabitants of Vicksburg ended up living in caves, and they made little houses in the caves. If you can believe that, they've got models of it, of what it looked like when people were living in a cave in Vicksburg. And they turned to they had such meager foodstuffs to eat that you can read at some points in the Civil War people cooked leather to eat, or they would eat rats or horse meat. But on July 4th, 1864, I believe, but it was the 4th of July, which today is the 5th of July. Vicksburg surrendered, and it was such a sore spot in the collective memory of the Vicksburg people that for a long, long time they didn't celebrate the 4th of July. It was a wound in their mind. It's kind of odd how a population can, I don't know, kind of integrate that into their psyche as a people. But they didn't want to celebrate July 4th, and I'm not real sure why. If this was reminding them of who won the war, maybe, but it looks as though it was really more about the relative famine that they had and uh, having lost the city. So it wasn't until all the way until 1947, after World War II, that the people of Vicksburg began to recognize and celebrate in a meager way the 4th of July. Hey, kitty. It's my buddy right there. Hey. Anyway, so that's a little bit of history about Vicksburg. Hope you're doing well. And I guess first and foremost, I would just want to let anybody know who sees this or who considers themselves student of history that they need to see that the activities of peoples and of populations is never a single thing. It's very complicated. Even within a family, you can see that people have different perspectives. But hope you're doing well, and spend time with my buddy here. Hey, hope you're doing well, and the war is over. The war is over.